Chapter 2: Propaganda versus Economics. Constructing a Myth. Abstract. The myth of black buying power is dismantled by taking primarily two lines of argumentation. A, as an issue born of a media environment itself, well suited to the transmission of propaganda, and B, as an issue of economics or economics reporting, where substantive research and data on the economic condition of black people is supplanted by more salacious and fallacious claims of economic strength. Keywords: public policy, economics, #BuyBlack. Black buying power is more propaganda than it is economics. That is, the financial side of the myth, while nuanced and even at times complicated, is relatively more easily dismissed once the fog of media and sloppy journalism is cleared. On the one hand, it is truly simple. For example, the median income for Black America was reported in 2018 at $40,258. Wilson, 2018. And there are roughly 40 million African Americans in the United States. For there to be what is popularly understood as more than 1 trillion in buying power, this would mean each and every single black person would have to spend at least every single penny earned. Every woman, child, and man, regardless of age, would have to spend it all to amass the claimed numbers. 40 million times 40,000 is 1.6 trillion, slightly more than the claimed $1.2 trillion in buying power. Worse, when measurements of wealth are made, a far more accurate assessment of actual economic condition, the projections make claims of power more dubious. If the racial wealth divide is left unaddressed and is not exacerbated further over the next 8 years, median black household wealth is on a path to hit zero by 2053, about 10 years after it is projected that racial minorities will comprise the majority of the nation's population. Muhammad et al., 2017, emphasis added. And further, with the U.S. set to become, quote, majority minority, end quote, by 2044, researchers say this spells major economic peril for the nation. Quote, if the racial wealth divide continues to accelerate, the economic conditions of Black and Latino households will have an increasingly adverse impact on the economy writ large, because the majority of U.S. households will no longer have enough wealth to stake their claim in the middle class. End quote. Lardy, 2017, emphasis added. Another leading researcher on the subject of Black economic history has put recently, at 1%, Black America retains today roughly the same percentage of the national wealth held in 1863. Baradaran, 2017, 9. And as yet another study concludes, regardless of the quality or condition of the national economy, Black people remain always in a, quote, permanent recession, end quote. Austin, 2008. More still, what are described as wealth and income, quote, gaps, end quote, between Black and white America continue either to widen or show signs of closing at rates which will literally take hundreds of years to achieve parity. United for a Fair Economy, 2004 to 2019. How then can there be so much, quote, power, end quote, in buying? How then can power be redefined as every Black person, including those too old or too young to even be in the workforce, retaining none of what they earn? Black people have little money and less wealth, as will be detailed below. Through a comparative review of related journalism, the reality of Black economic life is often unreflected and even suppressed beneath more wishful or fanciful emphasis and interpretations. Relative to the national economy and white America, against which economic gaps are measured, Black people, at roughly 14% of the population, represent or constitute or maintain a paltry 1% of the national wealth. If all the deposits in all the countries, so called, quote, minority, end quote, banks, were combined into one, it would rank 16th in the United States for total deposits and would still be hundreds of billions of dollars behind just the top three banks alone. And even within the false construct of buying power, Black people still only have 8%. Black people earn far less than their white counterparts, regardless of education levels. Inherent national anti Blackness means that socioeconomically, the value of homes owned by Black people drops, rendering largely meaningless even the idea of home ownership as a pathway to economic equality. Indeed, in all areas of life, the quote, cost of Blackness, end quote, Austin 2016, renders meaningless most claims of economic or material advance. Incarceration, police violence and surveillance, media related trauma, healthcare, and more all point to conditions which can only be said to be improvements over already inappropriate standards for human existence. But mostly, it remains still, as the late legendary legal scholar Derek Bell once summarized, that inequality is a matter of intentional public policy, not an issue of individual or community behavior. In fact, as Bell put it, if the nation's policies towards Blacks were revised to require weekly random roundups of several hundred Blacks who were then taken to a secluded place and shot, that policy would be more dramatic, but hardly different in result than the policies now in effect, which most of us feel powerless to change. Bell, 1999. It is perhaps this underlying sense of powerlessness which assists the effectiveness of the messaging which encourages a hope or sense of real power in the most welcomed, apolitical, and unthreatening activity, consuming. But the meaning of power is perversely distorted by the myth. Helped by the reporting of this issue, many mistakenly take power in the phrase buying power to mean something which resembles a form of real social, political, or even economic strength. With comparisons to other nations, repetitious display of headlines touting enormous sums like, quote, $1+ trillion, end quote, and with carefully constructed narratives which suggest that true collective life change can occur if only these sums were more intelligently put to use. The idea for many becomes that buying power is something that it is not. Power, in the phrase buying power, is not what economists consider when assessing the economic health of a group or country. Buying power is not wealth. It cannot be invested at will and used to create more for its investors. Buying power is not stocks, bonds, or land, and is not even real estate. It cannot be built upon, renovated, or flipped. Buying power is not income. It is not earned in exchange for labor, and it cannot be spent at will or used to pay one bill versus another. Buying power has its origins in government labor statistics meant to help assess where wages should be set relative to inflation, but is now, today, mostly a phrase created and propagated by marketers in an attempt to assist the business community govern its advertising revenue. Power, in the phrase buying power, strictly means the power consumers have to buy one available product over another. Put another way, power, in the phrase buying power, means only the power to generate wealth for one corporation or another. The studies from which most national discussion of buying power come are to be credited for being clear that their reports do not in any way relate to what most think of as genuine economic strength. They do point out that their work is not an assessment of wealth, income, ownership, and so on, the true indicators of economic strength. Where the report's authors fall most short is in clarifying the methods used to reach their conclusions and in clarifying in the press, which carries those conclusions, that these are not statements on actual economic conditions. It is primarily through the practice of popular journalism and commentary that allows the word power, in the phrase buying power, to lose all meaning. The term, quote, power, end quote, is redefined to mean shopping, but works to confuse potentially powerful communities and energies into what advertisers want most, which are consumers whose acts of generating wealth for others is magically redefined into a concept of individual and collective political, economic, or social power. The ability to turn the concept of power into a simple act of consuming what others own and produce is what makes the issue of buying power one more of propaganda than one of economics. Beginning in 2009, I began producing commentaries and subsequent research attempting to trace the origins of the concept of buying power and its popular dissemination in an effort to reconcile previously described inconsistencies between economic realities and the incessant claim that there lies dormant this currently incapacitated economic giant of buying power strength. What follows expands upon 10 years of tracking various reporting of buying power and related economic studies in an effort to identify the process by which the myth is developed, disseminated, and to estimate its impact. What I have found is that today Black buying power claims emerge from surveys of Black consumers conducted by the media monitoring group Nielsen and often without attribution from the more dominant source, the Selig Center for Economic Study, based in the Terry Business School within the Bank of America building in Athens, Georgia. In each case, both Nielsen and Selig make clear that buying power is not a measure of economic strength, and that it is a phrase meant to help the business community address itself to potential consumers. And in each case, both the numbers of Nielsen and Selig are popularly misinterpreted, poorly developed in their initial design, and then even more poorly reported by conventional presses and media. What magnifies the impact of buying power claims is that they are largely promoted by, and even the product of, a Black commercial press who would transform the original concept into one designed to specifically target Black audiences. Beginning with John H. Johnson and carried throughout Black commercial media to today via the National Newspaper Association, NNPA, Target Market News, through popular journalists, academics, and media personalities such as Tavis Smiley, Tom Joyner, and Dr. Julia Malvo, and also traditional civil rights organizations, including the Urban League and the NAACP. The myth has been propagated for two primary reasons. The first, less known, and garnering far less attention in the overall conversation, is that buying power is used as a means to attract advertising revenue by convincing white corporations of the potential in the Black consumer. The second reason for so heavily propagating the myth, far more popular and far more mythological, is as a means of collective uplift or empowerment. Buying power largely then becomes a way for contemporary leadership or punditry to rebrand particular and more conservative traditions of black political struggle, absent meaningful examination of the histories of these claims, their shortcomings, or criticism. Traditions of black political struggle which are most heavily promoted are those for which commercial presses have traditional political and economic preference. Traditions which favor entrepreneurial or business elements of black politics. Routinely in these presses, black buying power will be brought into discussions where allusions are made to moments in history when black business seemed on the rise or more well valued as part of struggles for freedom. This was the case recently when black buying power was raised in a defense of reparations, where it was argued that instead of cash, black people need another Black Wall Street. Court 2019. In a piece titled, quote, hashtag Buy Black reinforces efforts from civil rights, end quote. A defense of the hashtag Buy Black campaign. The myth of black buying power was mentioned within an allusion to traditions of black political struggle, which emphasized more conservative notions of self help, black business, and black capitalism. The idea of black capitalism goes back many decades, according to an NPR report which cited civil rights activist Booker T. Washington and Marcus Garvey advocacy for African Americans to create and do business with their own to build wealth in their community. Brown 2016. Focus on Garvey and Washington as doing, quote, business with their own, end quote, and as engaging in, quote, black capitalism, end quote, is in part routine and results from a bias rampant within commercial presses and media. Promoting entrepreneurial pathways to freedom works well for a business class propagating those ideas in their commercial media as a method of generating revenue from advertising purchased by white corporations. Many black political luminaries and aspirants have engaged forms of black capitalism, what Ofari described as, quote, economic nationalism, end quote, and may have then and still promoted buying power as having value in advancing the plight of black people. Before even the first government report to include the development of buying power as, quote, cost of living, end quote, studies in 1904, the concept had already evolved within black political and business circles. In 1897, for instance, the world's first black woman law professor, Ludi A. Lytle, was already describing racism's ability to, quote, degrade black buying power and credit, end quote, as she and many others would seek to expand black enterprise into black consumer spaces previously abandoned by whites. Henderson, 2017. And by 1900, Booker T. Washington had established the National Negro Business League, NNBL, to help fill that void. The NNBL and Washington worked explicitly within the logic that black business was key to black collective improvement, and his elevation to prominence helped, to this day, to promote the same. As a result of those lesser known, like Lytle, and those most prominent, still like Washington, the business enterprise approach to black struggle and the particular incorporation of the concept of buying power would soon dominate black political discourse. By the end of World War I, two clear variants of how to achieve an independent black economic nation dominated the historiography. The first focused on African American business development and entrepreneurial leadership, and the second on leveraging African American consumer buying power and grassroots leadership. In practice, however, the two strains often overlapped. People spent their money and participated in the separate group economy in ways that crossed such intellectual categories. Garrett, Scott, 2009, emphasis added. By 1925, Marcus Garvey was promoting the concept of black buying power within his Universal Negro Improvement Association, UNIA, and Negro World newspapers, even chastising rival W.E.B. Du Bois for belatedly realizing that the, quote, buying power of the Negro is the most tremendous force within his reach today, end quote. Mislin, 2013. By 1932, economist Paul K. Edwards published The Southern Urban Negro as a Consumer, which offered, quote, the first scholarly research that focused on minority consumers, end quote. Cooey, 2001, 24. A groundbreaking and detailed analysis of black consumer habits, marketing trends, and the, quote, negative attitudes, end quote, of many black consumers toward white advertising. And it would be immediately put to use in service of white business interests and set in motion a relationship between black consumer marketing material and black political and social movements and white commercial interests. Using Edwards' work as its inspiration, the white advertising firm W.B. Ziff and Company published The Negro Market in 1932 and devoted an entire rate book to the subject, The Negro Field, in 1934. Beginning in the 1920s, advertising executive William Ziff worked closely with major African American newspapers. He also encouraged white-owned companies to capitalize on Negro buying power and to increase their volume of advertising in the African American press. Garrett, Scott, 2009. But it is the reduction of black political struggles to variations of capitalist endeavor which further impose limitations on understanding these histories, their shortcomings, and on ideas of what can still yet be done. Commercial interests, black and white, have from the start become infused into and even dominate the full range of black political consciousness. And as a heavily promoted product of those commercial interests, buying power as a concept has come to play a particularly powerful role in black politics and inhibiting a better understanding of capitalism or the promise it offers as a solution. Before engaging more meaningfully the contradiction of capitalist enterprise as a collective salve, there will need to be a confrontation or reckoning with heavily promoted mythologies, such as this one, an idea promoted for decades by a business and marketing class, but taken by so many as progressive, even militant, radical, activist tactic. Again, O'Farrill remains correct. The lesson is that no matter how large or well organized a black political or social movement becomes, those involved must be equipped with the proper understanding of the American economic order. Unless they are, they will never use the correct approach in determining methods for the struggle against the conditions of corporate capitalism which are impoverishing Black America. O'Farrill, 1970, 39. Difficulty in learning the lesson extends largely from that fact that the struggle to understand the, quote, American economic order, end quote, never mind just buying power, is exacerbated by a particular historical context and media environment. New media technologies such as smartphones and tablets, along with websites, personal web video channels, and the existence of various social media outlets often confuse the issue, but it remains that our media environment is one largely constructed and run by the most elite corporations and private equity groups the world has ever seen. Internet media are still delivered by a handful of corporate owners, and these owners are themselves, directly or indirectly, via interlocking boards of directors, politics, race, gender, and class bias, linked assuring that what we see, read, and hear, even in the new media age in which we find ourselves, is carefully manicured. The choreographed nature of that media leave room for debate, perhaps in the realm of impact, but not at all in intent. In fact, propaganda, as a process of persuasion, it is value neutral. It is the intention behind the propaganda that demands scrutiny. And it is that intention which begs value judgments, not the propaganda itself. End quote. Snow 2014, emphasis added. Propaganda, consciously targeted messaging meant to impact, limit, manipulate, and form public opinion is, quote, any organized or concerted group effort or movement to spread a particular doctrine or a system of doctrines or principles. It is mass persuasion with a purpose that advantages the sender. End quote. Snow 2003, 61. Propaganda is also, quote, understood to have a persuasive function, intend to reach a sizable target audience, be representative of a specific group's agenda, and make use of faulty reasoning and slash or emotional appeals. End quote. Simmons, 2019. And today, propaganda has been described as, quote, the primary means by which the elite communicate with the rest of us, end quote. Noble, 2010. Just in the United States alone, propaganda has been essential to the development of national myths of origin, Bradley, 1998, and the construction of an anti Black consciousness, described by W.E.B. Du Bois as the, quote, propaganda of history, end quote. Du Bois, 1935, 711, meant both as a multimedia and multi-form attack against Black people, and one meant also to establish a false consciousness of a singular superior and white humanity. As Du Bois was reaching his conclusions, the field of communication studies was evolving as an extension of the commercial and political elite and their particular interest in developing a new white American identity, an ability to manipulate that identity for support of war, and a particular concept of the citizen as consumer, wedding the notions of democracy and capitalism into a new consumer consciousness. Included in this process was the popular rebranding of propaganda as public relations, marketing, or advertising. The long and global history of propaganda would, in the United States, take on a particular importance, power, and relevance in the 20th century. Government funding of communication studies research increased as methods for supporting war efforts, propagandizing the enemy, and generating support and enlistment at home were evolved and imported domestically as methods of developing consumers, creating new citizens out of European immigrants, as well as discrediting dissidents and dissident movements. Simpson, 1994, 1999. Today, while there may be renewed claims of foreign government infiltration and influence of U.S. media, that media is already awash in so much commercial and government interest that outside messaging struggles to find room. In 2018 alone, U.S. commercial media collected $163 billion in ad revenue from just the top 200 ad buyers, assuring that historic arguments regarding corporate influence over media content, framing, and bias remain as relevant as ever. Advertising Age 2019. Similarly, further complicating the matter, so much of what is often dismissed as, quote, entertainment, end quote, is itself the product of U.S. intelligence agencies and public relations, meaning that even our favorite television shows are often dramatized or comedic, ideological, political advertising delivered between more overt commercial marketing. The number of pro U.S. military and police programming written, produced, directed by current or former intelligence agents is nearly 2,000 in television alone. Alfred and Secker, 2017. What is promoted as, quote, news, end quote, is often government, military, and commercial interest packaged as objective reporting to disguise its function as, quote, message force multiplication, end quote. Barstow, 2008. Propaganda has been commercialized as public relations, popularized as brand marketing, and militarized as psychological warfare. It is no wonder that media theorist Marshall McLuhan once described advertising as a, quote, vast military operation, end quote, which helps in reducing us all to fish who could not have discovered water because, quote, an all pervasive environment is always beyond perception, end quote. McMahon and Soberman, 2002. Ultimately, the myth of black buying power is bolstered in its ominousness by a national demographic shift toward becoming, quote, majority minority, end quote, but in such a way that matches a media system already in place and described as one of, quote, apartheid, end quote. Gonzalez and Torres, 2012. That is, we already have a majority population of the so-called, quote, people of color, end quote, women and the poor, who are relegated to accept an imposed media environment produced by and for a minority affluent white population. Or, as has been said, our economic and social reality is fast coming to match an apartheid already existing in our media. Ball, 2014. Exploring the origins and rise of the myth of black buying power shows how that affluent white minority projects its interests by promoting them via ad spending in black media.